Audio on demand from Vision Christian Media.
Foundations.
But we miss so much of it because we don't go back to that culture and that context. And we get the general drift when we read that passage. Don't be stingy, but be generous, and don't be governed by money. But we actually miss the context. It means so much more.
Foundations. Understanding the Jewish foundations of our Christian faith. With Robbo Robinson and Mandy Warby.
Welcome to another episode of Foundations, and we're talking about context. That's really what Foundations is all about, understanding the context and how it's important for understanding the Bible correctly, and how sometimes we can read a word or a phrase and interpret it through a modern definition, resulting in a very wrong understanding. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. What did Jesus mean when he made reference to a bad or an evil eye?
It's interesting because the last couple of episodes we were talking about walking in the dust of our rabbi. Well, how do you walk in the dust of your rabbi? You walk as close to him as you possibly can, that the very dust that he stirs up when he's walking lands all over you, because you want to learn from every word he says, every nuance of his expression, everything he believes. You want to emulate him. And when a rabbi spoke, the people would sit and they would, the students would, embrace, and they would want to ruminate and chew on every single word that came from their rabbi's mouth. Because in Jewish culture, if the rabbi speaks, it's as though they're speaking for God. Doesn't mean that they consider a rabbi to be a human rabbi to be, perfect, where they can't make a mistake. It wasn't that, but it was reverence for the fact that this man had, when a rabbi becomes a rabbi, they study for years and years and years. So they're really well versed in Scripture. Many of them can just recite Scripture and the commentaries verbatim. So they're bathed in it. So the student wants to learn everything so that, they become just like them. But to be really honest with you, there were some things that Jesus said that were a little bit difficult to understand. There were times it was a little bit confusing. Well, actually, no, it wasn't confusing for the people in that day because they understood the culture. Right, they knew what he was referring to. But for us, we read it and we kind of go, I really can't get my head around what he was just saying. And the other thing is, the Bible is filled with idioms or what we would call, figures of speech. Like, for example, if I said to you, use the phrase to beat around the bush, well, you know what I'm referring to. Yep. And if somebody says, they've kicked the bucket, you know what that means. Somebody has just passed away. It's a little irreverent, I might add, but that's basically what it means. To get someone's goat, you know what that means, or you catch my drift.
Yep, now, I catch your drift.
Yeah, you do? Good, I'm glad. But the thing is that if you don't know those figures of speech, what you mean actually is no relation to the actual words that you've just used.
That's right.
Okay, so otherwise, if you use those and people don't know what you're talking about, they go, what are you doing running around kicking buckets?
Yeah, that's right.
And
they haven't caught your drift.
They haven't got that drift. That's exactly right. So I want to look at an idiom or a figure of speech that Jesus used that can, and we're talking about context here, and this kind of is one of those things where you think, hang on, he's just completely gone off subject. And so I want to look at the passage of Scripture from Matthew 6:19 to 25. If you want to start off with that, that'd be great.
So it starts by Jesus saying, "Don't store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroy and where thieves don't break in or steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also."
And then the next verses go on to say, "The eye is the lamp of the body. So when your eye is clear, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. And if the light that's in you is darkness, how great is that darkness?" And then...
So then Jesus continues to say, "No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You can't serve both God and wealth. For this reason I say to you, don't be worried about your life as to what you'll eat or what you'll drink, nor for your body as to what what you will put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing?
Now, that's a passage that we're all incredibly familiar with from the Sermon on the Mount, and we understand. He starts off by talking about not storing up physical or material wealth for yourself here. It's just going to corrode. It's going to eventually come to nothing and lose its value, but rather store up spiritual wealth and treasure. When moth and rust is not going to touch it, but it's stored in heaven with the Father, where he knows. And then, of course, he concludes the passage by saying, and you can't serve two masters. It's either God and spiritual wealth, or it's going to be physical wealth, money and possessions. But it can't be both.
Yeah.
It's one or the other. And you kind of go, yeah, I get that. That makes perfect sense. But
so what does the bad eye have to do with it?
Yeah, he starts talking about having a bad eye. Now, I've been to Israel, I've been to Turkey, I've been to Jordan. And one thing that's really clear in the Middle East is that there's great superstition, and particularly of what they call the evil eye. And you see this little blue and white eye everywhere, and it's particularly like everywhere in Turkey. But even in Israel, they've got this little picture of a little hand. It's called a Hamza, and inside it there's this little eye. And it's supposed to ward off the evil eye and evil spirit. So in Middle Eastern culture, this evil eye is very, very superstitious. So was Jesus superstitious? Well, no, he wasn't. Not at all. But in ancient Jewish culture, if you had an evil eye or a dark eye or a bad eye, you were a stingy person. You were a miser. You were greedy. You wanted to accumulate stuff for yourself, and you never, ever, ever bothered to think or consider anybody else. But if you weren't stingy, if you were generous, you were considered to have a good eye or a light. So there are depending on the translation of the Bible that you have, it could be an evil eye, a bad eye, a good eye. Whatever adjective your translation uses, it was actually it's an idiom. It's a pattern or a figure of speech that was used in Jewish culture to describe somebody who's stingy and a miser, as opposed to somebody who's generous and thoughtful and giving, who's happy to share.
Wow.
So you take that meaning of that Jewish Hebrew figure of speech, that idiom, and you sandwich that between what Jesus was talking about, and all of a sudden you go, that's what he's talking about.
It makes perfect sense.
It makes perfect sense. All of a sudden, he's wanting, and if you are stingy, if you're mean-spirited, well, you're tight, mean-fisted, and you lack compassion, you don't think about anybody else, whereas a generous person, they're filled with light. I mean, and then, okay, look at Jesus. I mean, was he filled with light, and yet he gave everything? What is God the Father like? Filled with light. The Father of lights, Scripture says. So generous that he gave his own Son.
Yeah.
And then you look at that contrasting view where, you got somebody who's a miser, and then you say, okay, now I have to hold this mirror up in front of me. What do I look like? Where am I on this scale? Am I sort of half in between? Am I really at one end of the spectrum or not? So it's a really fascinating way to read this scripture in its context, and suddenly the context makes a whole lot more sense. And he hasn't gone off on a tangent, and he's definitely not superstitious.
That's right.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, but I guess he's understanding the superstition of his culture to use that idiom or that phraseology to put it into perspective, into a way that they would completely understand. Yeah. To make sense of it all. Yeah, and what's really fascinating is how all pervading it still is to this day. Like the colour, the blue and the white of this little eye, this little evil eye. It even comes through in this turquoise aquary blue that's literally all over the ancient city seaport of, Jaffa today, but Joppa. Even the street signs are in this aqua blue, which is all sort of connected with it, all about this superstition of keeping away this evil eye. It's so all-pervasive and then it has been handed on through centuries, really. But we miss so much of it because we don't sort of study and look back. We don't go back to that culture and that context. And we get the general drift when we read that passage. Don't be stingy, but be generous, and don't be governed by money.
but we actually miss the context. It means so much more.
Well, that's more understanding of the context of the Scriptures, and that's what this program Foundations is really all about. So on the next program, we're going to take a look at why names are so important in Jewish culture. That's next time on Foundations.
This has been Foundations, a look at the Jewish foundations of our Christian faith. For study notes, resources and more, see vision.org.au/foundations.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.